So in any given constellation of neurons, these are firing with patterns that are ultimately predictable with respect to their pre-existing states, and they propagate forward as we would predict in terms of physical laws. That part is relatively straightforward. But you do that over 100,000 neurons, millions, billions. There's 10 to the 27 trillion possible synapses at the level of the brain. When you get to that level of complexity, then you get into the realm of jealousy, and you get into memory and the appreciation of music. And so really the fundamental mystery, kind of what we spoke about previously, is how we go from these fundamental properties of the brain, which aren't, again, particularly special. They're just neurons firing in ways that are completely predictable from their prior states. But it's when we examine that complexity and how that propagates in terms of psychological properties until you get to subjective states of mind, which are not a result of these patterns of neuronal firing, but they are tantamount to it, right? There's no difference between a constellation of neural activity and a unique psychological state of being, right?
Welcome to the Mixed Emotions podcast. This is your host, Mihir Oka.
Thank you so much for taking out the time,
No,
to
I'm
be
looking forward to
honest.
getting into it.
You must be extremely busy and, saying yes and accepting it's a pleasure to have you here. So thank you.
Oh,
The point of this podcast is that it acknowledges that life is not black and white. There are a lot of things that we take for granted. We do not see iterations behind decisions and we take context out of the park. And to get you on this podcast would be the fact that you talk about a lot of things from marketing to neuroscience to helping students to being a professor to helping brands build their businesses by incorporating the science that you studied. So, first and foremost, you're a neuroscientist, you're an author, you're a professor, and you distill the science that you studied and the things that fascinate you in the neuroscience department to, I don't know, make it easier for students to learn and also easier for brands to implement the science. Is that correct?
I think it's a great way to think about it. So yeah, as you mentioned me here, so I originally come from the world of academic neuroscience. So my PhD work focused on the neuroscience of perception and communication. So effectively how we go from the raw sensory signals in our environment, the sights and sounds and haptic sensations, and how we interpret these, how we build these rich inner worlds that only we can experience, right? So consciousness is by definition a private experience. So only we can experience this directly. But then we come to this task, of course, of communication. So how do we communicate these ideas and concepts in the social environment? And so that was my original kind of academic background. And really now for the past 15 years, my work and my research and my writing and my work with brands is really focused on how can we apply these ideas from psychology and neuroscience to the realm of marketing. And then another big focus of mine, of course, is to communicate these ideas in a classroom environment. So I teach both undergraduate, postgraduate, EMBA, and really again the focus there is how can we enable students to think differently about themselves in the world, and
Mhm.
that's really where psychology and neuroscience comes in. It really enables us to think differently about ourselves and think differently about the world. And then in the realm of business, so I teach at an international business school, Holt International Business School. How can we apply these ideas in the business environment, both in kind of the development of our approach to marketing, and then in terms of the specificities of how we execute on these marketing strategies as well.
To reiterate, your love for neuroscience, where does it come from? And is the world really unaware of, or what are the crazy things that are most likely not known to people that drive human behavior, decision making, human nature? That if people are, is that what you teach? Is that what you bring from the academic side onto a more generalistic side so that people really understand why they are and why they are who they are and what makes them do certain things?
So I think those are two big questions. So yeah, first to take your first question first, yeah, it's a good question. So I think being fascinated in human behavior, fascinated in this dichotomy or this tension between being a physical self, right? The brain is a physical system. You can touch it, you can feel it. And then also psychology, which is of course ephemeral, right? Where is jealousy? Where is hunger, right? These are ephemeral, subjective sensations. And so this is classic mind-body problem in psychology is how do you cross that divide? How do you go from being a physical self to also being a psychological self?
Yeah.
And for me, that question's always been incredibly fascinating. And I can't ever look at that problem and that tension and not be in awe of how paradoxical and interesting that is. So I think if I had to pinpoint an origin story or like a concept that really planted the seed for my interest in the field of psychology and neuroscience, it really is the natural tension between those two fields. And then really my goal in teaching about these concepts, both to a student audience as well as to a practitioner marketing business audience, is really to really elucidate what kind of the cumulative wisdom in the field teaches us about both of these concepts and how they interrelate. So what's really interesting in my experience is that everybody, regardless of how many classes or how many books they've read, whether they're an amateur scientist, or whether they're a PhD level scientist, whether they're a business practitioner, or whether they're a young 17-year-old student, we all have models of how we think people operate, right? We all have a sense of this is human nature, right? So you see it in the business world, this product will never work because people don't do X, or this product is going to be successful because people do X, or people like X, or people love X, right? And where does this kind of conviction and this intuition come from? It comes from their internalized model of what human nature is. So whether or not we have taken the time to study the cumulative wisdom and really understanding the best of what research teaches us about, let's say, human nature or psychological proclivities, all of us have a model of what we think that is already. And so really the big kind of challenge and opportunity of being an educator and a practitioner in this field is you get to, I think, enable people to align their model of human nature and their model of psychological proclivities and outcomes with a understanding of kind of the cumulative wisdom of the fields. We're tethering this intuition people may have about and tethering that to, again, our best empirical sense of what this is. And of course, that's not limited to science. A lot of fields over the years, from history to certain type of cultural studies, philosophy, helps weigh in, but it's really about building a multidisciplinary, evidence-based sense of human nature and about psychological and neuroscientific proclivities.
That is more of it's like a horizontal of anthropology, of culture, of neuroscience, of psychology, to then get into what really drives us and what motivates us, and expectations and rewards and desires and conviction. And these are all metaphysical concepts. They're not actually, they're essentially just the brain. I mean, everything above survival is metaphysical, in my opinion. And I'm guessing that everything would drive down to if it's going to put food on the table tomorrow, if it is everything that you do in the end, like Maslow's pyramid of needs, the laws that it defines would tell you what a person is doing and would give you an understanding or an explanation of why they do certain things, or at what stage of self actualization they are that they do these said things. My point is that since the field is massive, and to apply such things in marketing, the idea that have we understood the human brain fully, and are there any laws that we can use which are like sacrosanct, which are like principles, which are like non-changing, which can be replicated and to be used fully and finally, so that brands can or anybody can make use of? Are there laws, or have we not understood the brain well enough? Or if that is a question.
Sure. Yeah. So I would say no and no, right? There aren't really like bona fide just gravitational forces in the level of the brain that don't admit to any straightforward exceptions with respect to how these neuroscientific or the architecture of the brain and how these funnel up to psychological properties. Right? What we know about the brain, obviously, is that it's a physical system that's constrained by physical laws. There's nothing particularly special or revealing about how the brain operates. It's incredibly complex. And these complexities, when we really study them at the level of individual cells and individual neurons, they operate in a very straightforward way, right? So cells fire, as any neuroscience student knows, that the fundamental properties of neuronal firing is binary on off. This is with everything in the cortex. There's some exceptions there when it comes to the photoreceptors, which are in the back of the eye. But effectively, there's nothing incredibly mysterious about kind of the physical properties of the brain. In many ways, neurons are cells like any other biological cell in the body. What's really fascinating and what is very mysterious is how we get from the individual firing of individual cells and how we complexify that from two cells firing and how those influence each other and propagate neurotransmitters to a collection of 10, 20, 30, 10,000, 100,000. So in any given constellation of neurons, these are firing with patterns that are ultimately predictable with respect to their pre-existing states, and they propagate forward as we would predict in terms of physical laws. That part is relatively straightforward. But you do that over 100,000 neurons, millions, billions, there's 10 to the 27 trillion possible synapses at the level of the brain. When you get to that level of complexity, then you get into the realm of jealousy, and you get into memory and the appreciation of music. And so really still the fundamental mystery, kind of what we spoke about previously, is how we go from these fundamental properties of the brain, which aren't, again, particularly special. They're just neurons firing in ways that are completely predictable from their prior states. But it's when we examine that complexity and how that propagates in terms of psychological properties until you get to subjective states of mind, which are not a result of these patterns of neuronal firing, but they are tantamount to it, right? There's no difference between a constellation of neural activity and a unique psychological state of being, right? They are one and the same. This is this monist tradition of neuroscience where they're not two different things. They are effectively one and the same. Yeah, I don't think there's any kind of fundamental laws about the brain other than what we come to understand in Newtonian mechanics. But I think what's interesting is how you think about that with respect to psychological properties. And again, people are people, and there are some generalities when it comes to how people operate, right? For example, you want to operate in such a way where you seek pleasure and avoid pain, right? I wouldn't call that a law of human nature, because it does admit to exceptions, right? Some people enjoy pain and they don't have pleasure. There's people that go into into a cave and they meditate for 20 years and they try to
Yeah.
absolve themselves of all types of pleasureful experiences, right? Those people also have completely valid lives and psychological experiences. And so even something as simple and straightforward as seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, that doesn't not admit to any exceptions. So yeah, I think that's what kind of makes psychology, neuroscience, especially how we examine it in marketing, so fascinating, is there are always these exceptions and there is so much complexity which we get to grapple with.
Consciousness, I guess you're the rabbit hole of what is consciousness and where does it come from and which part of the brain. I think it's a rabbit hole. I had, like, back in the day during COVID, we used to have a lot of free time, and I'd taken a course on NLP and
Mm,
let's like neuro linguistic programming, and
yeah.
also on the fundamentals, like 101 of neuroscience. And it was like they were talking about neurons and magnesia just to understand where consciousness came from, because it's so magical,
Yeah.
this theory, that it's fascinating. I gave it up because COVID got over, and thankfully COVID got over, and we had to get back to our daily lives. But the idea that what is the connect between psychology and the physical aspect of the human mind, and where is it that makes sense is fascinating. And I think all efforts that are made to pursue where it comes from and how it works, I think it's a rabbit hole. What do you think? Do you think do you resonate?
It's really one of the biggest questions in neuroscience. And it is complex and it is very complicated, but there are some interesting ideas that help us. There's this great book called Being You by Anil Seth, who's a neuroscientist based in the UK, that's written about kind of some of the leading theories here. And I would hesitate to say that there is a concrete explanation that everybody is on board with. But I do think some of the kind of the leading ideas here are around this idea of predictive processing theory, that fundamentally human beings are predictive creatures, right? And we want to understand the state that is coming next, right? Because as time marches forward, whatever happened in the
Pattern
past, we
matching all the
can't
time.
change.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so the brain is a perpetual prediction machine. And it's
Right.
so much a prediction machine that effectively what the brain is doing at all times is it's predicting future states, both out in the external world, but as well, it's also making predictions about internal states as well. And we have this constant perpetual prediction that effectively is tantamount to conscious experience, that what we experience at any given moment in terms of our kind of subjective phenomenological state is fundamentally what our brain predicts we are going to feel, right? So there's this great example given in the book. I think it actually comes from the neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett. And she talks about this idea of the next time you're really thirsty, you're at the gym and you've worked out and you're really thirsty, you really crave water. The next time you're in that state, think about this, right? So you're going to take this cup of water or this bottle of water and you're going to bring it to your mouth and you will instantaneously feel better before that water has actually coming down your esophagus, right? Before the water has had any opportunity to replenish your Krebs cycles and to hydrate you and have all these physiological effects, like the millisecond you know that you're going to consume water, you already feel better, right? Before the water has any opportunity to have its physiological effects, you already feel better.
Oh
And
my
it's because, of
God.
course, that what we feel at any given time is what we predict we are going to feel. And so there is this real intrinsic connection between prediction and conscious experiences. And so I think we can understand emotional states to a certain extent of what we predict we should feel in a moment, given our best representation of the context and our physiological changes, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think absolutely consciousness is mysterious, and I think it may always remain a bit mysterious, but I think we are coming now to understand some of the relationships between our brains, especially in terms of how it makes predictions and conscious states of mind.
I was absolutely blown away by what you just said. Did you mention this in a book, Lisa Feldman Barrett?
She did. I think it's in How Emotions Are Made.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I don't have
So
that
she's written,
yet.
yeah, she's written two
Yeah.
big books. One is How Emotions Are Made. The other one is, I think it's
Seven and
called
a
Seven
half.
and a Half Laws.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. She's amazing. She's
Yeah,
incredible.
she's amazing. Yes. Incredible book. The seven and a half. Yeah, that's an incredible book. She's spoken about, just to go a little off topic, she's spoken about how we don't really have a grasp on if the emotions that we are eliciting from our face is actually what we are emoting, because that technically is just arrived upon as an agreeable I mean, it's like an agreeable response or an agreeable answer that people have from all walks of life, from all parts of the world, have said yes to, but experimentally it's not correct. It's like less than 33%, which is like you are more wrong than in predicting what a human being is emoting from his facial structure. Which I was like, if you don't know this, and we have gone down the wrong lane on this. I don't know. It's you don't know what you don't know.
Totally. And
Yeah.
yeah, and yet we're so confident that by looking at someone's expression that we know or we think we know what they're feeling. And so we do
Yeah.
have this kind of incredible ability, and Lisa's talked about this as well, called social cognition, right? Where just by looking at somebody instantaneously, we build a mental model inside our heads of what it's like to be that person, right? This is very kind of fundamental social skill and social proclivity called social cognition. And in service of that, we're gathering information about the context, we're gathering information about what we know to be true about the person. Our brains are gathering and seamlessly integrating information about their facial expression is given a lot of weight. And yet, of course, we can be wrong about this. And
Yeah.
yet we do it so
Yeah.
automatically, right? Just by looking at somebody, you instantly feel with absolute conviction, you know what it's like to be them. And yet, especially when we're giving a lot of weight to the facial expression, we can be completely off.
It's fascinating. I would like what you said about Lisa about taking a glass of water if you're thirsty and putting it to your mouth and you eliciting a response of feeling happy because you've quenched your thirst, not actually having quenched your thirst. Wonders in the smoke cessation clinic where I don't know, you don't have to really go through the process of smoking. Just put a smoke on your lips and then you don't have to light it, but you elicit. You could do it to a lot of processes. You could nudge yourself for the better or the worse.
Totally. Yeah. There's a lot of research on kind of a similar idea whereby if we think about the enjoyment we get from whether it's a cigarette or whether it's a piece of chocolate cake, and you're looking at, for example, the dopaminergic response in ventral
Yes.
striatum, a region that's very important for kind of the experience of pleasure. But really, it's also about the anticipation of pleasure. So if you're looking at a dopaminergic system, a dopaminergic surge as a metric for enjoyment, when does this dopaminergic surge peak? When is it at its absolute highest? It is the millisecond before you put the cigarette in your mouth or eat the chocolate cake, right? So pleasure is really an anticipation of pleasure. And so to the same extent that we were talking about earlier, that we are these kind of prediction machines to a very large extent, that I don't know any research on this looking at like addiction or cigarette sensation or anything like that, but really so much of the kind of enjoyment and the drive for pleasure comes from the anticipation of pleasure,
The
right? So like
expectation of
any
pleasure. Yeah, 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 yeah.
yeah, so like any
Wow.
gamer knows the feeling of like when you start up your game console and it like hums, and like that humming is like, ooh, it like feels so good because you know what's coming. And it's really owed
Yeah.
to, again, this fact that we're always in this kind of prediction business as human beings.
Fascinating. It's wow. All of the in all your concepts that you've learned as a neuroscientist in academia, have there been any crossroads with purpose and intention and free will? And what is the identity of a person? Because technically, let's keep marketing aside. When you're studying about the
Hmm.
brain, these things will arise as a metacognition level of yourself, even if you don't technically require it for survival. You still, once you are surviving, it is these thoughts that make you nervous, give you anxiety, the rumination of such things, of who am I, what is my purpose, or what is my identity, do I have free will? Do you have a sense of, I mean, if you study the science, does the science answer these questions? Or do you have some kind of, is your understanding of what these concepts are similar to what general understanding of what free will and purpose and identity is to normal people who you would resonate with? Or is there some kind of leverage that you have because you study the science?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think so. To the question of free will, for example, I think neuroscientists come out both ways on this topic, right? So you have somebody like Robert Sapolsky,
Hmm.
who's an incredibly influential neuroscientist and physiologist, does incredible work with primates, with the human stress response, and he
Yes.
comes out very firmly that free will is an illusion, right? And then you have other people in the field that come out the other way, right? So I don't think an orientation to neuroscience
Hmm.
biases one's response in either direction, which always found very fascinating. And my kind of read of it is much more in the camp of Robert Sapolsky, right? I think that we feel as though we are this
In
kind of
control.
conscious autonomous self, we're in control, right? We are free to choose at any given moment. So I don't think anybody disagrees with this idea that we feel as though we're in control, right? We feel as though we're autonomous, and we feel as though we could have chosen differently, right? So you wore the black shirt, but you could have worn your blue shirt, right? You could have chosen differently. But the question is, could we have actually chosen differently? And
Yes.
that's where people disagree. And what I would say, or what I would argue, is that no, we couldn't have chosen differently, right? Because choosing differently would mean being a totally different person. It would mean being the kind of person who would prefer blue instead of black in that moment, who would lived a different life such that they wind up at their closet and for whatever reason black looks better to them, or they're right-handed such that they're orienting their body towards grabbing a black thing instead of a blue thing that's on the left side of visual space, right? Ultimately, when we dissect a given, we see that it's many different levels. So you're influenced by the specific context, you're influenced by your particular perceptual system and how all this information is being interpreted by the brain, which is shaped by the specific neuroarchitecture of the brain up until that moment, which is informed somewhat by our genes and behavioral genetics, but also in terms of course, the totality of our experiences up until that point, right? So we're shaped by our experiences. And we
Yes.
didn't choose to have these experiences. We didn't choose for these experiences to shape our brains in such a way where we'd have a predilection towards one choice over the other. We feel as though we do, right? Because our conscious self is always downstream from all of this propagation of prior causes and complexities that we as the conscious entity just are not aware of at all. So yeah, my personal, opinion there, just to put my card on the table, is that no, we don't have free will. We feel as though we do, but this idea of free will it's ultimately illusion. Can you make an argument that's derived strictly from neuroscience that we don't have free will? I think really the millisecond that we accept the monist position, there's no room for free will, right? So there's this classic debate, which is not really a debate anymore. It's essentially
Out
we're,
there,
we're,
yeah.
we're pretty confident that the monist position is correct, which is that the brain is directly tantamount to our psychology, right? That we have
Right.
ideas, we have concepts, we have knowledge, we have phenomenological experiences, and all of that is ultimately a product of the brain and our physiology and our central nervous system. That when we talk about psychological states and we try to tie it to something physical, we're not talking about ectoplasm or something measurable. We're talking about ultimately physical states. And so once we come to understand that our psychological state is tantamount to a neuroscientific state, that doesn't leave any room for free will, right? Because the brain and our physiology more broadly, this is a physical system, right? It relies upon physical laws. It's that we live in a causal world where, a present state of mind, a present brain state, and all of its complexity, all 10 to the 27 synapses firing or not, that's ultimately caused directly from the millisecond prior to that of a constellation of neural activity, which was caused by the one preceding that, all the way back to the first neuron to ever fire in our brains, right? So all of this is a causal chain. And at no point in this causal chain are we free to step outside of that and somehow decide how we want the brain to fire. And what would it even mean for us to stand outside this causal chain, which is the brain, and deliberate? And whatever process of deliberation is also going to be a process of the brain, which is in a causal state, right? So I think when you do examine it strictly from a neuroscientific perspective, I don't think there's any room for free will. I think a lot of, whether they're neuroscientists or they're kind of neuroscience adjacent, they'll say that the brain is incredibly complex, which it is, and there's so much we don't know about, which is true. And somehow, amidst this ambiguity, this somehow leaves room for free will, right? That's so complex, and we don't know everything that there is, and so we can't say for certain that there's no free will. And I just don't feel that's a very compelling argument, right? Because it's saying that somehow the brain's mystery enables the wiggle room needed to take a position that we somehow need to have free will, or free will must exist as a result of that. And all that argues is that there's the brain is mysterious, but it doesn't follow from the brain's mystery that therefore we must have free will. I think those are totally separate orthogonal claims. So in any case, yeah, I think on the question of free will, that's my personal read of it. I know people do have very strong opinions on it, so I'm not trying to
That's all
proselytize
right.
to people. And yeah, but
That's all right.
yeah, I think whether we're looking at it strictly from a philosophical perspective or even from a strictly physical process, right? We're taking a look at the fundamental physics of what would enable free will to exist or not. I don't think there's any room for free will.
It not to disagree with you completely. It is very similar to how we don't know where consciousness comes from. And as you said, it's a mystery, and then that's the wiggle room that it gets, and that is where those conclusions are made based on a hypothesis that there is an ambiguity of consciousness, and that is where the idea of free will also originates from. But be that as it may, if you say that there is no free will, and going back to your earlier example of why did I choose the shirt that I wore, and I could have made that choice separately, or I would have made it differently. I would have been another person, or I would have had different cues, or I would have had a different genetic lining, or certain conditions that would have affected me to make that particular decision. We're talking a lot about personalization, which leads to a choice. And as we see, and as we live, and as we have this talk in 2025, AI is around, and we all know what it can do, and creatively as well, with not only with the reasoning but also with images and videos and text, and so realistic that you don't see that it is made from another human being, meaning that it can create hyper personalized content, and it can, this is just stepping on your idea of there not being free. There is just like life is just a set of well managed cues that you are taking time and again, but that's a little scary, do you think?
So I think a lot of people are uncomfortable with this idea that free will doesn't exist. Because I think that the first thing you think about if you're given that proposition is that that means I don't have any control in my life, that I'm merely,
The illusion of
uh,
control.
yeah, that you have an illusion of control, but there's no
Yeah.
actual control, and that you're merely at the whim of all of this context outside of you. And I do think that's true to a certain extent. I do think that we are, when it comes to context and it comes to circumstance can be quite
Yes.
decisive in how a person
Yes.
develops, how they live, right? We don't pick our family, we don't
Yes.
pick our genetics. We can't really take any credit for the fact that we've
Absolutely.
developed in a neurotypical trajectory. So the role of circumstance actually is much more decisive than we appreciate. So I think that's true. But I also think that the other kind of reaction people have is that there's no more mystery anymore, right? If everything is predetermined and everything is following along this kind of a causal chain, then there's no more mystery. And I don't think that's necessarily the right way to think about it, because this causal chain, however decisive it is, incredibly complex, and
Huge.
it's
Yes.
incredibly
Massive.
multifaceted
Yes. Yes.
in such a way where we have no idea why it's unfolding the way it is, or all the variables that are conspiring to combine to produce the next word you're going to say, or the next shirt you're going to pick, or the next decision you're going to feel like you made. It propagates forward in such a complex way that we, the conscious entity, which is the only entity that matters, we're constantly surprised. And so because we're constantly surprised and it feels mysterious from our perspective, that is really all that matters. And
I know.
I don't know
Yeah.
exactly how I'm going to finish this sentence, right? I'm surprised every word that comes out of my mouth. I find out about it, the moment you find out about it, right? So we don't know the next word we're going to say. We don't know the next thought that's going to pop into our heads, right? If we're not the authors of our thoughts, right? Thoughts come and go. They're mysterious. They originate from processes that we, the conscious entity, are not aware of, right? We, the conscious entity, we find out about it as soon as it arises into consciousness, right? Where was it before that? No idea, right? So we're surprised just the same. So I think on the one hand, as a statement of like metaphysics and a statement of what's fundamentally true about human autonomy and human decision making, I think we can confidently say that free will doesn't exist and free will is an illusion. But from the standpoint of how does this change my life? How does this lead me to make decisions differently or live my life differently? I actually don't think it has very strong implications at all, aside from the fact that I think it
Yeah.
should give us a much deeper appreciation for the role of luck and for the role of context and circumstance, and for all of the good fortunes we have to rightly be recognized as our good blessings, right? These aren't things that we can really take any credit for.
I think that's bang on. I think the idea that uh, if you think that free will does not exist, that does not mean you should understand it, because
Mm-hmm.
it goes beyond your understanding of the physical world and how the brain works and how the world works. So even if you say that free will does not exist, which means that you are open to choosing whatever you want to do, you still don't know how the world works. So even if you don't believe in it, that's great. If you don't believe in the aspect that free will exists, does not exist, that's great anyway, because we don't know what we don't know. But if you do believe in it, then you should still be wary, because you still don't know how it works. You don't know, like, the only fact that you know that it doesn't exist does not give you an answer. It is not the solution to your problems. You just don't know how exactly it works. You don't know the mechanism, the physical mechanism of how context works, or how circumstance works, or how serendipity would work, or how luck would work. Even if it is well placed cues, it's massive. The mechanism is beyond our conscious awareness and understanding of things.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. So if we were like much simpler creatures, and every single time you saw the color red, you'd have to get aggressive, and it would happen at, yeah,
Hmm.
you had no control, and it was just you're compelled by these cues in our environment, then the world would be a very different place, right? And we'd be
Yes.
we'd be so overcome with all this contextual circumstance that it would be very obvious that we wouldn't have free will, right? But because we're much more flexible, we're much more sophisticated, we have the power of association such that certain things may have prepotent characteristics. So color may bring about a certain change in some people sometimes, but there's rich symbolic layers to that,
Yes.
such that you're not compelled by it. It just contributes to a broader, richer, more complex set of computations that derive maybe a certain outcome or not. Then it doesn't feel from the outside that the free will is there or not. So we do have kind of this much more sophisticated set of processes which are responding to circumstance and responding to contextual cues. But yeah, I think that whichever way we come out in the free will debate, the things that we have to do to bring about whatever we want to bring about, whether it's a human flourishing or meaning or the pursuit of pleasurable experiences, etc. Those things matter, right? Phenomenological states
Yeah.
matter. Like our conscious states matter. We don't like to be experiencing horrendous pain, and so we're
Correct.
navigating our lives and responding to the environment in the best way that our apparatus knows how. So it matters the ultimate decision that's derived. It doesn't matter so much if you were ultimately in control of that process or not.
That's that's a very good way to put it. It's essentially a simulation debate, and the algorithm is so huge. I don't think it can be this also. It can be this, and it can be this also, or it can be x plus y plus z plus into raised to how many ever numbers that you have, and so on and so forth. And still, it'll be small and so on. Infinite number of possibilities which go beyond your understanding of how things work, and it is not when push comes to shove concept. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. I stumbled upon your blog, which was absolutely crazy. I think I the first time I mailed you, I wrote to you about it. You wrote something about planned serendipity around this concept itself, that it's all a point of well managed cues, and that is what you would want to elicit in a buyer. You would want it to be like, it should be no friction, no resistance, magic. It should be, the design should be so good that it shouldn't be there. And but you would want to elicit that feeling into the buyer or the person who's obviously purchasing stuff. That idea is what would be gold to a marketeer to elicit from his ideal customer profile. And if you could engineer that, if you could engineer luck, if you could engineer serendipity, how fascinating would that be? And is it as easy, or is it easier said than done?
It's not super easy, but it is possible to pull off. So this kind of idea of serendipity is one that I've been really fascinated by because it really lies at this intersection of psychology, neuroscience, and marketing. And it
Yes.
really inspired by it because it is a veil of this perspective that us as human beings, we are meaning seeking creatures, right? We want to understand why something happened to us, right? We're
Yes.
totally dissatisfied as humans with an explanation of, oh, that's random, right? So randomness
Mhm.
for the human is very difficult to understand. But randomness is it exists in the world, right? There are things that don't seem to have an origin, and there is some degree of randomness that is creating a set of circumstances that collide with our lives in certain ways. And so it's up to us naturally to interpret this. And so when we're in a situation where something inexplicable and random happens, how we interpret that really matters, right? It really matters in terms of how we think about the world and how we think about this particular set of events. And so there's been some really interesting research in this area that we come to think of an experience as being very meaningful when it has these three features. So it's when it's, for example, positive, right? It's a positive experience, or the random thing or seemingly random thing produced a positively valenced emotion. Number two, when it's surprising, right? When we don't or couldn't have predicted it ahead of time. And then lastly, when it is inexplicable, right? You don't have an explanation of why it happened, right? It feels like it happened because the universe has conspired for us, right?
Because it's
So
destiny.
we feel as though it's destiny, right? We
Yeah.
allowed this kind of meaning making process to
Yeah.
unfold, right? Because we need to
Yeah.
have an explanation as to why an event took place. And when this event is also surprising and it's positive, we tend to appreciate, or we tend to have a feeling that this must have happened for a special reason. And so this idea of serendipity is very powerful, of course, in our day-to-day lives. I think it trespasses into this idea of kind of a personal metaphysics, right? We all have a personal metaphysics. We all have a kind of assumption, a core set of assumptions about the way the universe is, right? Is it a positive universe or is it a negative universe? Is it a universe that rewards good people and punishes bad people, or is it a universe in which bad things can happen to good people, or is it a universe where things are predestined, or things happen randomly? We have, whether we've given it a lot of thought or not, we have our own kind of assumptions about the way the universe is, and how we interpret randomness is very important to our personal metaphysics. And when an experience happens, which again is positive, it's surprising, and it appears to be
Meaning.
random, right? There's no explanation. This gives us, I think, a renewed faith in the universe, right? It makes it feel as though we live in a positive universe, that good, whimsical things can happen to anybody for no reason, right? I think that's a universe that most of us would want to live in. And when these events happen to us, that's the kind of overwhelming feeling that we get. And so it is difficult to engineer these in practice because serendipity, by definition, is an experience that
Random. Yeah.
yeah, it tends to be
It has
random,
to be random. Yeah.
but there are instances in which you can construct environments and a set of circumstances such that these serendipitous moments are likely to happen, right? So we can't say that they're guaranteed to happen, but they're likely to happen. So some of the work that I do with marketing teams, brands, are around designing for these more kind of open-ended experiences, which are really fertile ground for the expression of serendipity.
Can you give me an example of how have you achieved some kind of serendipity or that serendipitous emotion of positivity, of randomness, and some form of an experience in a brand? That is my first question. And second is that, no, I think we'll go ahead with that. I think I've just it's gone out of my mind.
Sure.
Yeah, you can.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what examples in kind of product experiences, right? A
Oh,
product.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm
Yep.
so sorry to cut you off. I'm so sorry. Just let my thought flow out in terms of what I
Sure.
was wanting to ask you. What I wanted to ask you was that when we hear brands listening in into like stories about brands listening in into our conversations, and then we see an ad just telling us what we were talking about. Do you think that is forced kind of way of creating serendipity or a wrong way of creating serendipity? Is that a bad way of implementing planned serendipity? That's my second question. First question, yeah, you can take up.
Sure. So yeah, taking the first question first. So yeah, one way which we can see or can design for serendipitous experiences is through product encounters, right? So it's a great set of experiments by, I believe the researcher's name is Akyung Kim at University of Sydney, where, for example, you walk into a location and you're given a piece of chocolate, right? So that's for most people a very positive experience, and you either give it to them in a context that this product would be surprising, or where it would be expected, right? So you don't expect to get chocolate, for example, in the lobby of a bank, but you do expect to get it in a candy store, right? And then in the last condition, you either give it to them with an explanation as to why you're receiving this chocolate, or no explanation at all. And this set of experiments, that the set of circumstances that produced kind of feelings of serendipity and had the best outcomes was a piece of chocolate in the lobby of a bank and no explanation, right? That this person just walks away. And so this set of circumstances produced the most positive impressions of the product, but also led to these feelings of serendipity, right? So you have a set of experiences there which are positive, they're surprising, and they're inexplicable, right? There's no explanation, no understanding of as to why we should be having this experience. And the reason why it doesn't work so well in the circumstances that you described before, when we have brands that are listening in on us and we look for a product on our web browser and then we see it pop up on our Instagram feed, is because we have an explanation there. And the explanation, of course, is that the
Yeah.
brand is listening. And so
Yeah.
that's why we're having that experience. And so
Fair.
every digitally native consumer that's seen advertisements knows that there's data, there's
Yeah.
tracking and there's cookies and all sorts of things. So if a brand would be able to pull it off in a way where the explanation isn't so salient, then I think it could be effective in the digital world. But I think most of us realize that yeah, that's why we're having it. So the explanation is there.
And the idea of creating serendipity would be there just cause there is no reason why you would want, like, the creation of serendipity in a person's mind would be not in like directly proportional to him going and buying a product. It is just to create the sense of positivity when they are in a scenario that is good for you.
It's both. So it does produce these kind of positively valenced emotions, but as well, there's evidence suggesting that these feelings of serendipity really create this sense of meaning between the consumer, the brand, and the product, right? Because in the same way that when a serendipitous moment happens to us, we feel a deeper sense of meaning and attachment to that set of circumstances. We feel as if it happened for a reason. We feel as though the universe aligned just for us. That's this feeling of serendipity. And when that happens in a product encounter, we do feel this kind of deep sense of meaning associated with the product. So yes, it's positive, it's a great feeling, but it's also, it creates meaning, a meaningful connection between consumer and the product.
Fascinating. As a business owner, you should leave no stone unturned to create leads and market in a way that you're not spending too much money, and at the same time you are getting good positive impressions and ways that people really like to be in context with your brand, even if they're not little buyers. And this is one of the things that it achieves, is that you get a good feeling in terms of the stars aligning for you to, so it's like a written in your destiny that you had to be there at that particular point of time, and it's a positive experience. So I think it's like, I hope it is used by more people or more brands to be able to, because it's like there's no harm done. It's all good, and I don't know if you can spread positivity more. I think that's like the outcome, irrespective of your selfish interest of them buying your products, is good. Which
Definitely. Yeah, I think it's a strategy. It can be difficult to pull off. And it's also, I
yeah,
think, worth noting that it's not without its risk, right? Because the risk is for this particular set of consumers, maybe they just want, for example, excuse me, sorry, one second.
yeah, that's all right. It's all right. Take your time.
Yeah, so you can imagine maybe this like particular set of consumers, like they don't want to be surprised, right? They don't want to have a product encounter that they didn't expect, or they didn't want, or they didn't anticipate, right? So we have this concept in behavioral economics called risk aversion, right? Where some people, we all have our kind of constitutional position on this risk aversion spectrum, right? And so some of us are very kind of risk tolerant, some of us are very risk avoidant. And if we're,
Yes.
we're interacting with consumers that are especially risk avoidant, they don't want to be surprised. They don't want to have an unanticipated moment. Even if it is positive, there's a risk that it's beneath their expectations or it is surprising and for them, which is a negative way. So it is worthwhile to understand who the target market is such that they're at least open to these kinds of surprise moments.
Yeah, it'll be very hard. B2C would be easy. B2B would be really hard to create serendipitous experiences. I don't
Definitely,
know.
definitely, yeah. Basically, as a general rule, everything is easier from a psychological standpoint. Very easy to, or not easy, but easier to apply
Yeah.
consumer psychology to B2C than to B2B. Because B2B,
Mm,
it's one question only, which is this going to help my business? If it is,
correct.
great. If it's not, done,
Yeah.
right? For
Yeah.
B2C, you got to play in all these different dimensions, right? You got to play with serendipity and positivity and
Mhm.
aspirational self and identity, all these kind of cool things that just don't translate at all to B2B. All those things are potentially useful in B2B, but only insofar as they translate to the B part of the B2B, right? The second
Yes.
B, which is it important for my
Is-
business? Yeah.
Yes.
So
But in the end, it's still a person making a decision, right? Even if it's B2B, even though they are managed by budgets and they have to take permission, or if it's their own business or they're managing, there's a purchase department in between. In the end, it is still a team of people. In the end, it is still, you're saying that it is easier to apply consumer psychology to individual consumers than to a group of people managing a business. But you have you had experiences of times when you've implemented such things in B2B?
good question. So I think the decision making process is human mostly, but essentially it's in B2B, there's a much longer kind of selling cycle.
Yes.
These
Yeah.
are tend to be much larger contracts and there's less volume. And it is
Yes.
one that really involves more of a kind of a straightforward financial calculation, right? So what's the cost and what can I expect in terms of my overall revenue?
Yes.
And if it's a smart business decision maker, then of course you're going to assimilate considerations about the culture of your business. Culture is very important for business, right? Is
Yes.
there a direct ROI that you can make between improved culture, at least on certain dimensions, and these kind of business functions, higher revenue, lower cost? It's tenuous, but yeah, the connection's there. And then the better you can make that case, if you're the first B in the B2B, then the better chance that somebody's going to sign a $100,000 contract with you.
Yes.
But if you can't make that connection between all these other things, we're going to improve culture, we're going to provide executive coaching, we're going to do learning and development with your team. If you can't make that connection between whatever it is you're selling and making a business case for it, it's going to raise revenues or lower costs, then it's not a conversation that any reasonable decision maker in a second B is going to entertain, right? Think about it this way. If you were to go to a business and you're going to say, hey, I'm going to do all these things for you. I want you to pay me $50,000, but what I'm going to do has no impact either in the short term, medium term, long term of impacting in a positive way your business. It's not going to bring you any new revenue. It's not going to in any way lower your costs. Then why would anybody in
That's
B2B go
true.
for that, right?
Yeah.
and it's not to say that entertainment and learning and development for an organization and bringing in workshops that enhance collaboration between teams, all these things are important, but they're important because they're instrumental towards driving that business,
Growth.
right? So
Yes.
yeah.
Right.
So storytelling can be involved, but you have to tie it to the fundamentals of the business proposition, which, yeah, there's nothing wrong with B2B, but it does make it just more straightforward, right? It is a single dimension I think you're evaluating these things on.
That's right. Do you think that people's awareness of marketing tricks changes their behavior or has an effect on their spending habits?
Potentially, yeah, yes and no. I think that people do have intuitions about why they buy or why they like some brands and not others. And there's a lot of evidence suggesting that our intuitions about these things are wrong, right? That we buy for reasons that we don't really have any idea about, or that there's your ways of a retail environment being set up in such a way where we think we're buying for one reason, but we're actually buying for another reason. So I think we're generally pretty bad at introspecting about our true motivations of consumer behavior. I also think that a greater awareness of unique our unique kind of vulnerabilities as consumers doesn't always translate to being better consumers. So we like to think of ourselves as being these rational consumers that make good decisions, that are evidence-based, et cetera. But then again, study after study shows that we do make decisions for reasons that we have no idea about, right? And we're driven by forces and factors that don't really broach our conscious awareness. And if we're not aware of the full spectrum of variables that are influencing decision, how can we claim to be rational over this decision-making process? So I think it can. I think especially there's been a shift in terms of consumers being much more skeptical of brands and marketing teams. There's a lot of data coming out very recently suggesting that marketers are just not trusted anymore at all. That marketing claims aren't trusted, especially younger generations. Very kind of allergic to overt, explicit advertising because the source that's espousing this is just not trusted. There's much more kind of organic, more influencer marketing or micro nano influencers, et cetera, where it's more community based and it's more about what your peers are telling you about a brand as opposed to what the brand is telling you about it. There has been a shift in influence in that direction for sure.
You spoke about intuition of a person driving their decision in context. Is there a way of engineering intuition as well?
Engineering intuition. In terms of engineering a person's like what feels intuitive to them?
Yeah, intuition is gut, and gut is based on past experiences. Now, ideally speaking, it would be the same thing as personalization of choice and context, personalization of context, and the ability to. I think it'll be a long form, like the road to intuition would be through personalization of choice. And then you have the person, then you would exactly know how he or she would behave in a situation because you know how their intuition is, because you have created context where it's essentially data analysis to the scale of, I don't know, it's quite a lot of data analysis about personal behavior.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're getting at there, but I think it's going to run into kind of the roadblock what we discussed before, which is that human beings are not straightforward with respect to context. So you can design a certain retail environment or given decision architecture in such a way where behaviors become probabilistically more likely. But that's going to work for some people some of the time, but it's not going to be at all kind of decisive. Obviously, in marketing, all we have is the probabilities. We're not working. It's not particle physics, right? We can't measure specific muons, and
that's where free will comes in.
yeah, exactly. Or the perception of free will, anyways. Yeah,
perception of free will. Yeah. See, you've written two books. One is Blindsight, and the other is Brands That Mean Business. I think one would be on consumer psychology, more from a consumer point of view, and the other would be for businesses to leverage consumer psychology to be able to sell better. What was your research journey like? Was it, I'm sure it would be different for both books, But what was your experience like while writing both books? Yeah, and can you tell me more about it?
Sure. Really, the first book, Blindsight, was really about something we spoke about before, which is what's the true nature of consumer psychology, right? So all of us feel again or want to feel as if we're rational actors making decisions based on good evidence, et cetera. What are the actual variables and what are the actual forces and influences in the consumer environment that would lead us to choose a certain brand over another or lead us to be compelled by a certain ad over the other, right? So there's this rich overlap between marketing and neuroscience in the sense that marketers want to understand and predict and to drive behavior, right? And
Yeah,
neuroscientists, on the other hand, we want
right.
to understand and predict. We don't necessarily want to drive behavior, but we do want to understand it, right? So this is the melding of those two perspectives. And yeah, the research process was really talking to a lot of both kind of practitioners and marketing disciplines, as well as other social scientists to really flesh out this intersection with as much texture as possible. So the book's really organized in terms of our kind of psychological and neuroscientific faculties, going from kind of perception, sensation, memory to decision making, cognitive psychology, sociality, ethics,
Uh,
storytelling. So, all these different things that we do on a day to day basis, but exploring each of those through the realm of marketing and consumerism. So that was Blindsight. And that was,
yeah,
again, as you mentioned, oriented towards the consumer. So it's really for the everyday person to sort of understand the neuroscientific influence of marketing and advertising. Branding that means business is really, as the name suggests, really how to build these enduring bonds between a company and consumers, because a brand is deeply psychological, right? So a brand matters when and only when it matters to human beings, especially if we're diving into the world of B2C. So the book is really
yes.
about how do we harness psychology, social neuroscience, anthropology, all these very human disciplines, and put some business and branding parameters around them such that we can actually etch these bonds between a brand, product, companies, because human beings don't do businesses with companies, they do businesses with brands. And so brands are these kind of very human facing elements of the corporate world, and how do we humanize those as much as possible. So it's really a brand psychology book, but oriented specifically to B2C.
What tips would you give? See, if I was a business and I had to add maximum value to my customer, I would dive into the science behind why marketing would work and then implement those principles so that I have science and math backed data to get better estimates on whether my experiments would work or not, even though they're experiments. You've written books on the consumer aspect, which is more on the self awareness side of the tricks that marketers could play on them, and what brands should do to be able to better communicate their story to have a greater connect with the consumer and create, as we say, a brand. What do you think um, amateurs or beginners get wrong? What are some quick tips, or where should a person start, or how should a person start to get it right, or to get it probabilistically?
In terms of the marketing side of things, I do think that I do a lot of advising with the startups
Mm-hmm.
in the Bay Area. I think a lot of the difficulties that especially young startups have at the very beginning is they do have this idea, they have this hypothesis, and they tend to go a bit too broad too quickly, right? Because really the essence of strategy is sacrifice, right? You want to be all things for all people. You want to be something specific to someone specific. And especially in the very beginning, really the essence of this is to get as specialized as possible, right? Solve one big problem or make this one aspect of this specific, small, well-defined target market, make their lives easier in such a way where they're willing to pay you for this, right? And don't try to
Yeah.
go too big too quickly. You can always iterate, you can always expand. But in the very beginning, you really have to validate this initial hypothesis. And before
Yeah.
you start obsessing over colorways or this icon or this logo or this or that. What is fundamentally your, in kind of MBA speak, what's your value proposition? What's your value
Yeah.
proposition and who is it for? And if you can solve a really important problem that makes people's lives easier, make their lives better, more efficient, et cetera, and they're willing to pay you for it, then you have the foundations of a solvent business. But until you have that, you can't do anything else. And so I think I'm a huge branding guy. I love branding, but I think really branding has its role after we reach this stage, which is called product market fit, right? When you have this validation of this hypothesis. And really only after that can you really invest and can you scale up using these incredible tools of branding. Yeah, I think for the person just starting out thinking about this, don't go too broad too quickly. Really think specialized, right? You don't have to be all things to all people. You shouldn't be all things to all people. Be something specific to someone specific.
But what you're saying is then marketing does not solve a bad product, or does it not cover for should it not cover for a bad product? You should be able to sell even if your product is bad.
It takes a lot, right? So I would argue that there are some examples of bad products that have existed and still survive. But there's something, I think those are the kind of the exceptions that make the rule, right? So you think about Coca-Cola, for example, right? I think most people, especially in the modern world, we have health concerns. Selling sugary water, sugary liquid is not a good business model. It's a terrible product. They invest $15 billion a year in brand marketing. So they've built this incredible brand such that there's not a soul alive on the earth that hasn't heard of Coca-Cola, and that they've made this sugary beverage synonymous with happiness and Christmas and family,
celebrations,
et cetera, et cetera.
and
Celebrations, exactly. Yeah, so I do think if Coca-Cola didn't exist, right, let's just say history is this alternative reality and Coca-Cola doesn't exist. If it were to launch today in 2025 with that identical product, I don't think they would survive, right? Because I don't think the branding, the legwork you'd have to do to brand this, the millions of dollars, the decades. Coca-Cola is, I think it's founded in 1895. We're talking over 120 years 130 years of brand marketing. Really difficult. So yeah, it's possible to have a bad product, but it takes 130 years and hundreds of billions of dollars to build it. Yeah, it is possible, but it's much more the exception than the rule.
Fair. We spoke about personalization a lot. We spoke about free will a lot. What do you think of personal freedom in all of this? And the fact that I'm sure you'll be getting this a lot. The ethics of fair use of marketing is there. To my mind, it would be that the entire game, the full book of marketing can be brought under the scanner of deception to the extent of where does persuasion lead to coercion? Where does it go switch sides from it? You are persuading somebody to buy versus you are coercing somebody to buy. What do you think about that?
Yeah, so it's a big debate in the field. A lot of research that I do is on this idea of kind of marketing ethics and how can we develop a framework that enables both regulators and consumers and marketers to feel good about all of this. And so I think it really requires us to define marketing, right? So the way that I define marketing is it really is about kind of trading value, right? That marketing is this art and science of navigating the exchange of value between company and consumer. In a classic case, the company puts something out into the marketplace. The consumer can find it, they can interrogate it, they can decide to, let's say, send money to the company in exchange for the product, right? So in that case, it's a fair and equal exchange of value. The consumer gets the product and the company gets the money, right? So that's marketing in a pretty typical sense. And I don't think there's any ethical quagmires about that, provided that the consumer has the ability to interrogate the product, to understand it, to evaluate it, project forward reasonably, and then to decide if they want to engage in this value exchange with the company. Where it gets into issues is when this is not transparent or where there is not sufficient consumer power. So really some of the foundations of antitrust legislation, for example, is when you don't have sufficient competition such that any product the consumer can get their hand on that they may want or need is owned by a very limited set of companies, such that there's not sufficient competition, there's not enough substitutability, such that the consumer can say, I want this product and
there'll
not
be a
the other
monopoly,
product, Yeah, so you can't have monopolies or
Yeah.
oligopolies, and that's
Mhm.
very harmful for consumers because they don't have
Yeah.
consumer power, consumer choice, right? The other ways in
Yeah.
which it can get ethically ambiguous or have some ethical difficulties is when there's difficulties discerning what the actual product is, right? So in the case of a physical product, very straightforward. In the case of a digital platform, very difficult, right? So I'm assuming you're on Instagram, I'm on Instagram, right? We don't pay for Instagram, right? And
Yeah.
yet we get this kind of product experience. But of course, the consumers, the true consumers for Meta aren't you or I, or not the individual users, they are advertisers, right?
Yeah.
Because we effectively, our attention and our engagement, our data, that's the product that's being sold
Yeah.
to advertisers. And this is not hyperbolic. This is, if we actually break down the revenue of Meta, Instagram makes about $35 billion a year in advertising alone. Very small portion of that is that the people paying subscription fees for Instagram, but their primary source of revenue, i.e., their customers, the definition of what a customer is, your source of revenue, that comes from advertisers, right? So there's
Right.
difficulty there when it's not clear what the product is or what types of value is being extracted from you as the human product in this instance. So yeah, there's some definitely some ethical guidelines that need to be in place in those types of instances as well.
Also, I think that the ethics debate is far polarized with the aspect that Meta is not a non-profit. It
Mm-hmm.
will want to generate revenue, and you are using its platform. So the idea of transparency or fair use of data, where you are creating user-generated content, you are signing away your rights to agreements that you agree upon when you install the application. It's all, you're not context dependent, you are forced to be on the platform because your friends are on the platform. But I guess that would be good serendipity, or that would be good context, that you want to be on the app because your friends are on the app, because everybody's on the app. It is a non-negotiable for you to be on the app. Now, I'm not sure if people really see this or take this as a point that even Meta has to earn money, and there are no free lunches, and this is the price that you have to pay. So I'm not sure how is this a fair debate in the first place.
Yeah, I think it's very fair, right? So yeah, they're not a nonprofit; they're a for-profit, publicly traded company. Their very nature is to make money. I
Yep.
think Meta is somewhat unique in the sense that they're not a monopoly, right? There's other ad dollars that can be
Socials,
set in different
yes.
ways.
Hmm.
There's other social media for sure, but as you mentioned, these network effects are very strong, right? So
Yes.
if all your friends are on Facebook and Instagram, you either cannot be on Facebook and Instagram and stand on principle, but you're also very lonely, right? And
Yeah.
that's not very good, right? That has its own very
That has
negative
its own
consequences. So I
problems.
think, yeah, so I think the most relevant ethical debates when it comes to Meta, for example, is really about age gating, right? Anybody 18 years and older, college students, adults, we have the deliberative capacity to make these judgments. If you're 11, if you're 12, and you're in
Yeah.
middle school and all your friends are on these things, do you have the deliberative capacity? I would argue that you don't. And a
Fair.
lot of the evidence coming out, looking at, for example, depression, rates of depression, anxiety, et cetera, and there's research indicating a very causal relationship between one's social media use and these types of negative outcomes, particularly for young girls. I do think that's really an area of ethical concern. And
Right.
it's not in the business's best interest. Absolutely not.
Right.
It's not in the business interest. Everybody 12 to Instagram has 2.5 billion
Yes.
users. So if they're going to say anybody between the ages of, let's say, 10 and 18 who can use the platform now, we're saying they can't use those. We're talking about hundreds of millions of users, which is a huge hit to their revenue, right? So I think it is
Yes.
an instance, and I'm not necessarily a huge fan of regulation in all instances, but I do think when a business has no incentive to do this and every business incentive not to do it, there does need to be a strong regulatory response. And I think there
Framework.
is enough cumulative evidence suggesting that this is against the public good, especially for young people, which society is supposed to protect, that there should be a serious conversation about this.
Man, I think this has been an incredible conversation, and time has just zipped by at the speed of light. I don't think I've noticed. I have two questions more for you with regards to number one being that earlier we spoke about the product, it being exception to the rule that good marketing can save a bad product. But I was going through one of the clips that were making the rounds on social where Rory Sutherland mentioned your book and I think lines from Blindside on the podcast that was Diary of a CEO, and
Mm-hmm.
he said that having a great brand, he quoted from your book, which mentioned that having a great brand means that you get to play the game of capitalism on easy mode. Wouldn't that mean that if you have good marketing skills, then it's and you can spend the money, then and you've built a good brand, then it shouldn't matter. Then you can sell anything, and the product comes second, the brand comes first.
There are a few examples of that for sure. So I do think, yeah, generally speaking, having a great brand is an amazing asset, right? And it helps in all of these different dimensions, whether it's brand awareness, whether it's your pricing power, whether it's your the flexibility you have in terms of launching new products or going into a new industry, the flexibility of the brand. Yeah, it's a massive asset. Product, though, I would argue, is underneath marketing, right? So product is, one of the four P's. This is an expression of the marketing strategy. And
Yes.
so if the strategy is poor and it derives a bad product, then I think that's a done deal. If you have a great strategy, but you get the product wrong, consumers, as we see in that clip, consumers can be very forgiving, right? So Apple hasn't always knocked it out of the
Yes.
park. Apple Vision
Hmm.
Pro is a pretty abject failure. They've had
Yeah.
some issues with Apple Maps over the years, but Apple is a world-class brand, right? And
Yeah.
very few consumers are willing to throw away their iPhones because they don't like Apple Maps or they don't like insert failed product here. So the brand can, in some instances, compensate for bad products. There's also, as we spoke about, Coca-Cola, right? It's a very brand oriented business, right? If you have a
Yeah.
generic brand or a poor brand putting out sugar water, that's not going to be compelling to any market. But because the brand is not merely generic, but it's about happiness and all these ideals and family wholesomeness, et cetera, it enables this otherwise kind of mediocre product to actually be fairly successful. So I do think it's a trade-off between being a brand-driven company or being a product-driven company. There are industries, luxury or lifestyle, where really the primary value that you're giving to the market is the brand, right? Nobody carries around a $35,000 Birkin bag because it's good at carrying things around, right? It's not a product, it's the brand that is really the lion's share of the value. Yeah, I do think the product is important, but yeah, there are instances, of course, where the brand can compensate there.
I think, as you said earlier, that until like when you're starting small and you're just starting out, it is not it's less of the vision, less of the marketing, more of if your product has a product market fit. And once you have shown that you can provide value, that is when customers or people start to trust you, and then you have the ability to create brand out of your existing trust that you've developed because of the product that you've made. So yes, product would always come first, but on the long run, it'll be the brand and the brand vision that will take over, and then you can sell whatever you want.
Yeah, and
Yes.
and there's always exceptions there. So I would say, generally speaking, product is primary, and it is about establishing product market fit. But there's examples of brand market fit. So there's Liquid Death is the ultimate example where it's
Yes, I was gonna come to that.
it's
Yes.
yeah, it's the definition of a commodity product, right? Water is water is water. Mike Cesario, CEO, said, I have this great idea for a water brand. If I can get the brand to stick and the brand resonates, I can get water. I can package water. And so he took out a bank loan for, I think, $15,000 to launch their first brand marketing commercial. The brand
Blew up. Yeah.
yeah, the brand blew up and now has this great problem to have, which is fulfilling all these orders for water. So it's an example where it wasn't product market fit, it was brand market fit, which so there's always exceptions, right? Which would that's what makes B2C so interesting.
Yeah, it is. It's fascinating. There's another company in water which technically the salespeople just stand on the streets and they distribute water for free, and their concept is that the water is free. All the money that we make is through advertising that is printed on our bottles. So the advertisers pay the
Oh,
manufacturing costs,
interesting.
pay for all that you see on the physical body of the bottle, and we make enough profit so that you can we can give it to you for free. And I was like, wow,
Oh, that's
what a
fascinating.
concept. Yeah.
Yeah. So they're just selling ad space effectively.
Yeah, they're selling ad space.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah. I forget what it is. Free water. So I don't know what it's called. I'll let you know
Okay.
what it's called. I have one last
Nice.
question for you, which
Yeah.
is my sample set question, which ideally um I ask everybody, which is why do you do what you do? And what do you think is the purpose of life in general?
So the first question, geez, if I'm honest, I have no idea. I have no idea why I do the things that I do. That's the mystery of life, right? You feel compelled to go in a certain direction, or you're driven by kind of curiosity. So you can look at the kind of the most immediate kind of like proximal motivations, right? Like I do a lot of what I do because I enjoy it and I'm curious about the ideas, right?
Yeah.
That's the easy explanation. Why
Mm-hmm.
am I curious about these particular ideas and why do I enjoy these particular things? I have no idea, right? I have no idea why I am the way that I am. And I think there are some kind of limits to self-discovery in a certain way, right? So you could get to that fundamental explanation. It would probably come to a particular set of experiences or particular genes that are folding into
Yeah.
certain types of proteins. So yeah, that's the short
Fair.
answer there. And then yeah, and then the meaning of life. Geez, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if it there is a meaning there, right? I don't think there's a like a singular meaning of life. I think you want to live a good life, a fulfilling life, and I think you want to enable people to do the same. And I think you want to enable a society that enables human flourishing and enables the flourishing of sentient creatures more generally. So I
Mm-hmm.
guess if it has a purpose, it would be to enable the flourishing of conscious entities, human or otherwise.
What do you think is the purpose of your life? What is your purpose? If there is one, would this be
Mm.
that?
Yeah, maybe this would be that would be that. Yeah, doing my small part to that end.
It's a pretty cool one. Kudos to that. Thank you so much, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking out the time. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
Yeah,
Thank,
it's
yeah.
yeah, no, it's just yeah. So I was just gonna say, yeah, no, it's been a pleasure chatting with you as well. Really enjoyed the different strains of topics and conversations. A lot of fun chatting with you, and yeah, maybe we'll chat again soon.
Thank you so much for tuning in, you guys. If you like this, then you can hit the like button. The algorithm likes it, gives me more views, and maybe I can contemplate on keeping this channel for free for you to see. If you hit the subscribe button, the algorithm likes that as well. But unlike the like button, this is more useful because you'd be actually notified by every time we do drop a video on this channel. If you have any complaints regarding the content that we drop or the questions that we ask, or you want to give us any suggestions with questions or people that you want us to interview, we have added a feedback um, form in the description. You are very welcome to fill that up and let me know if you hated this content and you do not want to see my face ever again, and do not want to share it with anybody, and do not want to refer this kind of content with anyone, then until you do tune in to my next episode or my last episode, or you do tune in, I would like to wish you in Truman Burbank's very own words, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Cheers.